Hello and welcome to the second video of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In this video, I'm just looking at some key extracts and explaining the key points about them. This is all linked to a revision guide for GCSE, which is available on my website, amysmithliterature.wordpress.com. So if you want a copy of that revision guide to download the resources for yourself, then head over there. Okay, extract 6 focuses on mystery and suspense, and it's from chapter 2, in which Addison dreams of Mr. Hyde. And the question at the bottom of the page says, starting with this extract, write about how Stevenson creates an atmosphere of mystery and suspense in the novel. So let's read the extract. 6 o'clock struck on the bells of the church that was so conveniently near to Mr. Addison's dwelling, and still he was digging at the problem. Hitherto it had touched him on the intellectual side alone, but now his imagination was also engaged, or rather enslaved, and as he lay and tossed in the gross darkness of the night and the curtained room, Mr. Enfield's tale went by before his mind in a scroll of lighted pictures. He would be aware of the great field of lamps of a nocturnal city, then of the figure of a man walking swiftly, then of a child running from the doctors, and then these met, and that human juggernaut trod the child down and passed on regardless of her screams. Or else he would see a room in a rich house where his friend lay asleep, dreaming and smiling at his dreams. And then the door of that room would be opened, the curtains of the bed plucked apart, the sleeper recalled, and lo, there would stand by his side a figure to whom power was given, even at that dead hour. He must rise and do its bidding. The figure in these two phases haunted the lawyer all night, and if at any time he dozed over, it was but to see it glide more stealthily through the sleeping houses, or move the more swiftly and still the more swiftly, even to dizziness, through wider labyrinths of lamp-lighted city, and every street corner crush a child and leave her screaming. And still the figure had no face by which he might know it. Even in his dreams it had no face, or one that baffled him and melted before his eyes, and thus it was that there sprang up and grew apace in the lawyer's mind a singularly strong, almost inordinate curiosity to behold the features of the real Mr. Hyde. If he could but once set eyes on him, he thought the mystery would lighten, and perhaps roll altogether away, as was the habit of mysterious things when well examined. He might see a reason for his friend's strange preference or bondage, call it which you please, and even for the startling clause of the will. At least it would be a face worth seeing, the face of a man who was without the bowels of mercy, a face which had but to show itself to raise up in the mind of the unimpressionable Enfield a spirit of enduring hatred. From that time forward, Mr. Addison began to haunt the door in the by-street of shops. In the morning before office hours, at noon when business was plenty and time scarce, at night under the face of the fogged city moon, by all lights and at all hours of solitude or concourse, the lawyer was to be found on his chosen post. If he be Mr. Hyde, he thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. So in chapter 1, Addison heard Enfield's tale of Hyde trampling the young girl, and now he's having a nightmare about that particular incident. It's really interesting that the start of the extract emphasises the religious context. So we have those church bells ringing, and those church bells symbolise good, and then they contrast with Hyde's evil, and we know that Hyde is frequently referred to as being devilish, as being satanic. It's also notable that the language used to describe Hyde changes. So we have Addison dreaming, recounting the story that he heard earlier in the day, and we see him say that then of a child running from the doctors, and these met, and that human juggernaut trod the child down. So this is all really familiar from chapter 1, except there's a really significant change. So Enfield described Hyde as a damned juggernaut, and Addison sees him as a human juggernaut. Now that change might seem really small, but it's so significant because what worries Addison more than anything is that Hyde isn't a supernatural character, that he's actually a profoundly human character. The word damned evokes that sense of being supernatural. It's something devilish, something satanic, something that's going to go to hell or has come out of hell. So something entirely irrational and supernatural. Whereas the word human indicates that actually maybe this is not a supernatural creation sent by the devil. This is a normal person who does the most horrific things. And if a normal person can do the most horrific things, then what can other people do? What is Addison capable of? What is Enfield capable of? So Addison is falling into this kind of pit of anxiety and concern because he's starting to ponder what the human condition really is and how evil human beings can actually be. And as this happens, it's all kind of framed in this language of nighttime. We've got the labyrinths of the lamplighted city, and we've got the darkness, and we've got this kind of very black nighttime setting. And that creates that atmosphere of mystery and suspense, because one thing that nighttime and darkness does is it prevents you from seeing properly. And Addison cannot see the features of Mr. Hyde. He can't see his face. He can't imagine what Hyde actually looks like. And this idea of fog is all linked in with that, because fog obscures vision as well. And one of the ways that Stevenson is then creating this atmosphere of mystery and suspense is then by withholding that information, by showing it as impossible to achieve. Okay, so if I was going to answer the question, I would explore this idea of not knowing who Hyde is exactly, the anxiety about whether he's supernatural or human, and then how that information is being withheld in the text. Right, our next extract is focusing on the idea of the duality of man. And just to explain this theme a little bit, duality means two. So the duality of man means that every human being has got two sides to them. And in this text, that's the good side and the evil side. We've got Jekyll and we've got Hyde. We've got innocence and we've got violence. So we've all got two sides to us, the novel is saying. But actually what really worries Addison and what really worries some of the characters in the text is, what if that duality of man isn't really duality? What if every single being at the same moment is both good and evil? Because Jekyll is Hyde and Hyde is Jekyll. Yes, maybe they're split into two different physical forms and all of that, but actually fundamentally they are the same person. So we have this idea of the duality in mind, but underneath that there's something darker, even more worrying, that actually there's a singular person who is both good and bad simultaneously. Okay, so we're going to look at this extract from chapter 10, in which Jekyll describes transforming into Hyde. And the question says, starting with this extract, how does Stevenson present the darker side of human nature? So the evil side of my nature, to which I had now transferred the stamping efficacy, was less robust and less developed than the good which I had just opposed. Again, in the course of my life, which had been, after all, 9/10 a life of effort, virtue and control, it had been much less exercised and much less exhausted. And hence, as I think, it came about that Edward Hyde was so much smaller, slighter and younger than Henry Jekyll. Even as good shone upon the countenance of the one, evil was written broadly and plainly on the face of the other. Evil besides, which I must still believe to be the lethal side of man, had left on that body an imprint of deformity and decay. And yet, when I looked upon that ugly idol in the glass, I was conscious of no repugnance, rather a leap of welcome. This too was myself. It seemed natural and human. In my eyes it bore a livelier image of the spirit. It seemed more express and single than the imperfect and divided countenance I had hitherto accustomed to call mine. And in so far as I was doubtless right, I have observed that when I wore the semblance of Edward Hyde, none could come near me at first without a visible misgiving of the flesh. This, as I take it, was because all human beings, as we meet them, are commingled out of good and evil, and Edward Hyde, alone in the ranks of mankind, was pure evil. I lingered but a moment at the mirror. The second and conclusive experiment had yet to be attempted. It yet remained to be seen if I had lost my identity beyond redemption and must flee before daylight from a house that was no longer mine. And hurrying back to my cabinet, I once more prepared and drank the cup, once more suffered the pangs of dissolution, and came to myself once more with the character, the stature, and the face of Henry Jekyll. Okay, so chapter 10 is written in the first person, and it purports to be Jekyll's written confession of what's happened in terms of the potion and the crimes that Hyde has committed. Now, Gothic writers often use this technique of documentary evidence, and they do this because it creates an impression of realism, even while the narrative contains supernatural events. So it's really similar to using Utterson as a focalizer for the text, because Utterson is so rational and reliable and trustable that if he's witnessing these events and reacting to them, then it gives him that sense of realism as well. So in this chapter, Jekyll says that his previous life had been 9/10 a life of effort, virtue, and control. So it seems that when he was a younger man, Jekyll had to really struggle to be well behaved. Virtue means those positive qualities like integrity, morality, goodness, compassion, kindness, that we all encourage everyone to have. So Jekyll says that he had to work really hard to have those virtues, to have that integrity. But he only worked really hard for 9/10 of the time. So there's an indication that for some of the time, he actually just let all of that facade drop and he risked his reputation by behaving a little bit more badly than he should. And there's quite a few hints of that in chapter 10, where Jekyll says that as a younger man, he behaved in a way that he shouldn't. So even before he creates the potion, he's really aware that his kind of personality split into two halves. There's the facade, the well-behaved facade that he presents to everybody, that facade of respectability, and then there's the other side to him where he has darker, more dangerous desires that he wants to act upon. So even before he makes a potion, he's aware of that duality of man. And then he makes a potion and he takes a potion in this extract and he describes Henry Jekyll as being good and he describes Hyde as being evil. Now this devilish imagery used to describe Hyde is found as a motif throughout the whole novel. But here, Jekyll isn't repulsed by this idea of evil. He's actually attracted to it. Because when he becomes Hyde, he can indulge in all of those desires that he has as Jekyll, but that he shouldn't act on. But if he acts on those desires when he's Hyde, no one will know who he is and he can just change back into Jekyll and he doesn't have to face the consequences of what he's doing. So despite all of this and the devilish imagery that's being used, Jekyll insists that Hyde is natural and human. And I think this is where the real worrying part of the novel is, that it's not some strange scientific experiment that creates Hyde necessarily. It's not that Hyde is a supernatural force, but actually Hyde is just a really natural and human instinct that Jekyll has with or without the potion, and that actually a lot of the characters in the novel have, whether they like to admit it or not. So what the novel is saying about this darker side of human nature is that actually we all have it, whether or not we experiment and dabble with science or with the supernatural or whatever it is. And that's really the worrying crux of the novel. Right, chapter or extract 8 then, and here we're looking at reputation and secrecy. So this is an extract from chapter 7, and in this chapter Utterson and Enfield are speaking to Jekyll through the window of his house. Jekyll won't come outside, and we know later on in the novel that's because he's worried about transforming into Hyde in the street. And the question says, starting with this extract, how does Stevenson present Victorian ideas about reputation and secrecy? So let's read through the extract. The court was very cool and a little damp, and full of premature twilight, although the sky, high up overhead, was still bright with sunset. The middle one of the 3 windows was halfway open, and sitting close beside it, taking the air with an infinite sadness of mien, like some disconsolate prisoner, Utterson saw Jekyll. "What, Jekyll," he cried, "I trust you are better." "I am very low, Utterson," replied the doctor drearily, "very low. It will not last long, thank God." "You stay too much indoors," said the lawyer. "You should be out whipping up the circulation like Mr. Enfield and me. This is my cousin, Mr. Enfield, Dr. Jekyll. Come now, get your hat and take a quick turn with us." "You are very good," sighed the other. "I should like to very much, but no, it is quite impossible. I dare not. But indeed, Utterson, I am very glad to see you. This is really a great pleasure. I would ask you, Mr. Enfield, up, but the place is really not fit." "Why then," said the lawyer good-naturedly, "the best thing we can do is to stay down here and speak with you from where we are." "That is just about what I was about to venture to propose," returned the doctor with a smile. But the words were hardly uttered before the smile was struck out of his face and succeeded by an expression of such abject terror and despair as froze the very blood of the two gentlemen below. They saw it but for a glimpse, for the window was instantly thrust down. But that glimpse had been sufficient, and they turned and left the court without a word. In silence, too, they traversed the by-street, and it was not until they had come into a neighbouring thoroughfare, where even upon a Sunday there was still some stirrings of life, that Mr. Addison at last turned and looked at his companion. They were both pale, and there was an answering horror in their eyes. God forgive us, said Mr. Addison. But Mr. Enfield only nodded his head very seriously and walked on once more in silence. So in this chapter, we know that Addison is aware of Hyde's violent actions. So when Hyde is speaking to Jekyll, we have it in that context, that Addison is concerned about his relationship with Hyde. He's concerned about what Hyde might do to Jekyll, because Addison believes that Jekyll and Hyde are two completely separate people. Because of all of this, Addison has distanced himself a little bit from Jekyll in recent weeks and hasn't spent much time with him. However, Addison still clearly has Jekyll on his mind, and as he and Enfield walk through Soho, they see Jekyll at the window of his cabinet or his office, and they stop to talk to him. The description of this setting in the first paragraph is really interesting, and it emphasises the coming of darkness, both literally and metaphorically. So the court is full of premature twilight, and twilight is that falling of nighttime. The word premature means that nighttime is coming early. So we have this sense that darkness is seeping into the world, taking over the world. And if we link that in with the question about secrecy, there's a sense that the secret events of the novel can take place at night, and that secrecy is spreading throughout the text. Then we have Jekyll being described as a disconsolate prisoner. Now, disconsolate means incredibly sad. He's lost his way. He seems really distressed. And of course, Jekyll is a prisoner, metaphorically a prisoner to Hyde, because Hyde will not, he can't go outside, because if he goes outside, he might turn into Hyde. So he's being imprisoned by his own addiction to turning into Hyde. So as they talk, Jekyll's face transforms into abject terror and despair. So this is complete distress, fear, horror, angst as well. And because of this, he closes the window. So here we have another secret. Jekyll closes the window to stop Addison and Enfield from seeing what his secret is. We assume as the reader that he's being taken over by Hyde at this moment. Addison and Enfield get a glimpse of that, but Jekyll tries to keep that secret. Then Enfield and Addison remain quiet. So again, we have more secrets here. They've seen something unspeakable, something that they must repress, that they mustn't admit that they have seen. And one of the reasons why they can't talk about this is because of the idea of reputation. So in order to maintain a good reputation, a Victorian gentleman had to be kind of very respectable and behave very well, be very virtuous with integrity and morality and all of that. And what Enfield and Addison have seen really shakes that idea of reputation for Dr. Jekyll. He's not respectable because there's something mysterious and secret and dark happening to him. So that's the reason why they remain quiet, in order to protect their friend's reputation. Right, extract 9 then, and here we're focusing on violence. This extract's from chapter 1, and it describes Hyde's attack on the young girl. And the question simply says, starting with this extract, how does Stevenson present the theme of violence? Well, it was this way, returned Mr. Enfield. I was coming home from some place at the end of the world, about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning, and my way lay through a part of town where there was literally nothing to be seen but lamps. Street after street, and all the folks asleep, street after street, all lighted up as if for a procession, and all as empty as a church, till at last I got into that state of mind where a man listens and begins to long for the sight of a policeman. All at once I saw 2 figures, one a little man who was stumping along eastward at a good walk, and the other a girl of maybe 8 or 10 who was running as hard as she was able down a cross street. Well, sir, the 2 ran into one another naturally enough at the corner. And then came the horrible part of the thing, for the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. It sounds nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. It wasn't like a man, it was like some damned juggernaut. I gave a few hello, took to my heels, collared my gentleman, and brought him back to where there was already quite a group about the screaming child. He was perfectly cool and made no resistance, but gave me one look, so ugly that it brought out the sweat on me like running. The people who had turned out were the girl's own family, and pretty soon the doctor, for whom she had been sent, put in his appearance. Well, the child was not much the worse, more frightened, according to the sawbones, and there you might have supposed would be an end to it. But there was one curious circumstance. I had taken a loathing to my gentleman at first sight. So had the child's family, which was only natural. But the doctor's case was what struck me. He was the usual cut-and-dry apothecary of no particular age and colour, with a strong Edinburgh accent, and about as unemotional as a bagpipe. Well, sir, he was like the rest of us. Every time he looked at my prisoner, I saw that Sawbones turn sick and white with the desire to kill him. I knew what was in his mind, just as he knew what was in mine, and killing being out of the question, we did the next best. We told the man we could and would make such a scandal out of this as should make his name stink from one end of London to the other. So in the extract, Enfield's describing the story of Hyde trampling the young girl, and this episode takes place at night when Enfield is walking through Soho. So he sees a young girl running down the street, and this girl symbolises innocence and goodness. She is a child who becomes the victim of a brutal attack. Then Enfield sees Hyde, and Hyde trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. So that juxtaposition between the violence of Hyde and the innocence and goodness of the child is really important here. It's also significant that Hyde is trampling calmly. So yes, this is a very violent incident, but he's actually quite calm and cold and calculating about the way he does this. It's not the kind of rage that we would expect from such a moment of violence. And then he leaves her screaming on the ground. So Hyde walks away. He leaves the kind of effect of his violence in pain and suffering, and he pays no attention to it. So then Enfield describes Hyde as a damned juggernaut. So the violence is so extreme that he describes him as being something damned, something devilish, something hellish. Enfield then says that Hyde causes instant hatred in the witnesses, so partly because of the violent act and partly because people have this instinctive reaction against him. And this brings out violence in the witnesses as well. So it's almost as if this one act of violence has triggered violence in everyone else. So the violence starts to spread from Hyde and affect the other people who are there. And this is really emphasised by the reaction of the Sawbones, who has a desire to kill Hyde. Now, the Sawbones is a doctor, a very specific type of doctor, who would have worked in Whitehall and in some of the kind of more difficult parts of London at the time. His name kind of tells you what he does. He would have maybe done amputations and so on. He would not necessarily have had access to the kind of resources that doctors these days do. And he could be hired by families to do whatever they needed medically. And he has a desire to kill Hyde. So this person who has seen every situation imaginable, all of the most horrific events that he would have witnessed in the darker parts of London at that time, and he is brought out in this desire to kill Hyde. So that's really quite a shocking reaction from the Sawbones. If I was writing about this question, I would also link this to the murder of Danvers Carew in chapter 4, and it's described in a similar way. Hyde hits Danvers Carew with the cane and then he tramples on him. The difference being in chapter 4 he doesn't trample calmly, he tramples full of rage. So I would definitely be writing about that scene as well. Okay, our last extract is extract 10, and we're focusing on setting here. This extract is from chapter 1, and in this, Addison and Enfield are walking through Soho. And the question is, how does Stevenson present the setting as having two sides? So let's read the extract. It chanced on one of these rambles that their way led them down a by-street in a busy quarter of London. The street was small and what is called quiet, but it drove a thriving trade on the weekdays. The inhabitants were all doing well, it seemed, and all emulously hoping to do better still, and laying out the surplus of their gains in coquetry, so that the shop fronts stood along that thoroughfare with an air of invitation, like rows of smiling saleswomen. Even on Sunday, when it veiled its more florid charms and lay comparatively empty of passage, the street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighbourhood, like a fire in a forest, and with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of note, instantly caught and pleased the eye of the passenger. 2 doors from one corner, on the left hand going east, the line was broken by the entry of a court, and just at that point a certain sinister block of building thrust forward its gable on the street. It was 2 stories high, showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story, and a blind forehead of discoloured wall on the upper, and bore in every feature the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and disdained. Tramps slouched into the recesses and struck matches on the panels. Children kept shop upon the steps. The schoolboy had tried his knife in the mouldings, and for close on a generation no one had appeared to drive away these random visitors or to repair their ravages. Mr. Enfield and the lawyer were on the other side of the by-street, but when they came abreast of the entry, the foreman lifted up his cane and pointed. "Did you ever remark that door?" he asked, and when his companion had replied in the affirmative, "It is connected in my mind," added he, "with a very odd story." Okay, so we've got Addison and Enfield walking through Soho, or at least the part of London that we think of as being Soho, so critics often use that word to describe it. And this description seems to be a positive one. Soho does a thriving trade, so thriving means it's doing well, people are making money. The inhabitants, so the people who live there, are all doing very well. The shop fronts have an air of invitation, so they're brightly coloured, they're well looked after, they're inviting customers in. And the street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighbourhood. So dingy means kind of not doing very well, run down, neglected. So this particular street seems to be a really nice one, a really positive one to be in. However, there are hints at darker forces at work, and the question's asking us about the setting having 2 sides. So one way we can unpick this is by looking at the description of the street shining like a fire in a forest. And this simile is really interesting because fire is necessary, it produces heat, you can cook on it, etc., etc. But also fire is extremely destructive, especially if you have a forest fire. The speed of that destruction, of that conflagration, is immense. So what we have here is a symbol of quick and speedy and complete destruction, which is of course what Hyde does later on in the novel. And this positive setting is also disrupted by the block of the building that thrust forward its gable on the street. The door to that building is blistered and disdained, and there's evidence of negligence. So this building that it's talking about is the back door of Jekyll's house. We know that the front of Jekyll's house opens onto a much more respectable part of London, but the back door is here. This is a door into the laboratory. Now, often in Victorian times, the back door of a surgeon's house would be the place where the body snatchers would deliver the bodies to. So there's something already a little bit insalubrious about this particular door. And it's thrust forward on into the street, so it's personified, and it's as if it's almost attacking the street. It's spreading its influence over the street. It's blistered, so there's some sense maybe of disease here, and again think about that idea of spreading, how the evil spreads throughout London. And it's neglected as well. Now, if I was writing about the 2 sides of the setting in the novel as well, I would definitely look at the description of the front of Jekyll's house, which is presented as, again, being a place of 2 sides. It's quite respectable, but it's on a street where some of the houses have been sold off and broken into flats and so on. So there's 2 sides to that, the front of Jekyll's house as well. And I'd probably also look at the darkness and the fog spreading over the city too. So thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you find it useful. All of the resources you'll need are on my website, which is amysmithliterature.wordpress.com. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye.